What's going on, guys? Scar coming at you with another Magic the Gathering video. In today's video, we're going to be diving into the meta. Now that we have roughly about a week since Standard has kind of rotated, we are now in the new Standard for the year, as we're going to get new sets. We're just going to add decks and cards to the format going forward. We're not going to get any cuts. I figured I'd break down kind of what has evolved, what has kind of popped up as being as the dominant deck currently in the format. In this list, we do have 6 decks. Typically I do these in 5 just because I do like the top 5, but I figure that 2 of them are kind of similar in the sense of what they're trying to do. You can kind of look at what I'm seeing right here, the decks that we're going to do. They're kind of actually at the top of the page, so if you want to just kind of skip ahead to the various decks to kind of get a look at each one of those, you definitely can. But I figured I'm going to give you a deck by deck breakdown, kind of talk about each one, why I think certain ones kind of stand out, why, you know, they may have shifted. We are going to go in reverse order, starting from the bottom, working our way to the top. It's not that these decks are in that particular order because this deck is better than that deck. It's just going to be like overall a meta, you know, where right now majority of players are playing certain decks. So with that being said, let's dive in each deck, kind of break it down, kind of talk about each one, and then we'll wrap it up at the end. And, you know, we'll talk about the meta as a whole. So this first deck up is actually the Lotus Ramp. If you haven't seen this deck, it's actually a pretty interesting deck. It utilizes all of the ramp spells that are currently in Magic the Gathering for the most part. It is kind of like a weird Temur style deck. What we're trying to do here is we're trying to ramp a bunch of lands onto the battlefield, take advantage of the new ability of Lotus Cobra, which whenever you play a land due to its landfall, it generates a mana of a particular color of your choice until end of turn. You get a couple of these out, possibly you get generated 2 mana for every land you play. And then get like an Omnath out, which has another stacking ability. Arrow helps kind of ramp up that as well, and possibly even turn 5 or turn 4, turn 5, depending how lucky you are with the mana. You can overall play a Genesis Ultimatum and pretty much just have so much advantage over your opponent based on what you can really play against them. If you throw in the Rune Crab, which is 0/3 with landfall, it actually makes your opponent mill 3 cards every time you play a land. So with all the ramp we have in the deck, it allows us to just kind of play a bunch of lands, kind of just force our opponent to just mill. We're going to play a bunch of things. We're going to do a lot of damage. We're going to hopefully eliminate things from their battlefield and just kind of take advantage of them. The reason why this deck is so good is that the value is just so good. I mean, you know, it has a pretty solid curve. I mean, it rounds up pretty nicely at 3. The goal is to possibly get to like at least 5 mana really to go off. But I mean, by turn 3, this is where the deck really pops, just because we hit a lot of our major players that are going to play us a lot of lands on the battlefield. If we have a Lotus Cobra on turn 2, we play like one of our turn 3 spells additionally with the turn 3 land. To play that turn 3 spell, we get to create an additional mana, dropping something like a Cultivate down, which then it drops another mana to then possibly play another 2-drop, or even play a Rune Crab or something like that. But overall, the deck has the value. I mean, it's pretty crazy in how effective this does, because once it goes off, like if you're at a point where you think your opponent can go off, there's a good chance they can, just because they have so many ways to just get so much value out of the deck. If you haven't seen Omnath, he's a very good card. Besides him entering the battlefield and you draw on a card, whenever a land enters the battlefield the first time, you gain 4 life. If it's the second time, you gain 4 mana, one of each color that Omnath is. If it's the third time, he deals 4 damage to each opponent in each planeswalker you don't control. So essentially, it's like if you can get 3 lands in one turn with like a Cultivate, possibly a rolling Regrowth, or maybe even a Uro trigger, you're going to be doing a crazy bunch of things to your opponent. And the fact is, we do play the adventure cards of Bone Crusher Giant and Brazen Bar. We're just on the fact that they're just very solid cards, you know, bouncing things back to your opponent's hands. Bone Crusher Giant for that spot removal that you may need at a certain point, just to kind of, you know, maybe get something like they have on their board out of the way so you can swing in for some aggressive damage and get into the top end of either Escape the Wilds, which allows us to play additional land, as well as, you know, look at the top 5 cards of our library. We play these exile cards this way until our next turn. So it allows us to just get that much more, you know, efficient mana and things to kind of take advantage of our opponent. It's just like overall this deck is trying to outvalue your opponent, because a lot of things that you may see with a couple of these decks, the goal of the deck is just to get X amount of value compared to your opponent, which if you have a lot of value, you can play a lot of things. Your opponent, if they don't play anything that really ramps that hard, or they don't have a lot of mana, they really can't do as much as you can in one turn. It's kind of like we're just ramping like crazy just to get a large mana pool to then just pull off these crazy triggers and things like that to just take advantage of your opponent. And with that being said, I feel like over time as this format develops, and I think as people kind of fine-tune like a newer deck like this, I feel like this deck is going to be one of those decks that kind of rise up, just because I think the efficiency of it is pretty solid. Because even if you don't draw like an Omnath, but you're still like ramping up very hard, I mean, casting a Genesis Ultimatum, Escape the Wilds, and or an Omnath, I think those are the key cards to the deck. And if you cast any of those, I mean, essentially your opponent's so far behind, because I mean, just Genesis Ultimatum by itself allowing us to put up to 5 target permanents from our library, our permanent cards from among them on the battlefield the rest of our hand. Allows us essentially to draw 5 cards. If X amount are permanents, they go to on the battlefield. If any of them are not, they go to our hand. So it's like we draw and also get to play permanents regardless of what they are. So it's lands, things like that. If you have the right cards out on the battlefield, you get like additional Lotus cover, play like 4 lands off of this. I mean, geez, I could only imagine how much mana you're going to produce and be able to even possibly do it again on the same turn, which is also pretty crazy. And like I said, I think this is one of those decks that can definitely stick around and also even develop into a bigger threat. I just think as the format develops and people kind of figure out what's like kind of good, I think we're still in that experimental phase. But like I said, this is currently at the bottom of the list. It's like the top 6 most played deck. But, it's one of those decks I could see definitely bumping up as more people kind of collect more cards and eventually start experimenting with it. And if it becomes one of those top decks at the top of the standard ladder, I think this is definitely something people are definitely going to play more often than they currently do. So this next deck on the list is a deck that you've probably seen. I don't have to do too much explanation for it. Even before standard came in, prior to rotation, this was one of the main meta decks in the standard 2021 play mode, which is Simic Adventure. Essentially what this deck is, it's just another value deck. Essentially you want to play things like Lucky Clover to get a very very large play of wishes. You got Brazen Bars to have multiple bounce effects back to your opponent's permanents to kind of stall them out. Playing Love Struck Beast, getting multiple 1/1 counters. Merfolk Secret Keeper, possibly to mill your opponent a bunch of cards if you have a Lucky Clover out, or even mill yourself so you can get an Earl back from the graveyard easier. You got Edgewall Innkeeper for whenever we play these cards that have an adventure ability on them. We get to draw a card when they come onto the battlefield. And also the Great Henge just makes our things just that much larger. So Beanstalk Giant gets a +1/+1 counter. We draw a card every time we play a creature. When we tap it to gain the 2 mana it produces, we also gain 2 life. The mana base is pretty solid in that sense. I actually think you could probably splash in the new modal lands. I think this list just hasn't updated to that sense. But I think the modal lands definitely could fit in here because I do think there's a blue-green one. I could be wrong. Let me know in the comments below if I am wrong. We got things to gain life. And because the reason why this deck is so strong, you have it Lucky Clover combined with a Fey of Wishes, you can go into your Wish board, essentially, which is our 15-card sideboard. The one thing I do know is if you import this deck, and also I think the Temur deck off of Aether Hub, I'm going to leave the links for all these decks off of Aether Hub based on their meta stand-ins. Because they're marked as like traditional standard, they actually like yell at you saying that the cards in the sideboard are illegal. But essentially, if you just go to the deck itself and click on change it to normal standard, it should stop yelling at you. I don't know if the cards from the starter decks that I think are standard legal, why they wouldn't allow you to play them. It may just be some weird bug in the game, but that's the one thing I will say this. So if you come and comment that they're not working or they're illegal cards, that's the one thing I noticed to fix the problem, because I was curious as to why it was giving me a deck that actually had illegal cards, and when I looked into it I just realized what happened. But with that being said, I mean, the deck gets more efficient because Fey of Wishes combined with Lucky Clover, again back on that, allows you to get multiple things from your wish board depending on the situation. If you start ramping up pretty hard, you can always get a Nugan to wipe out your opponent's board. You can always get things to just draw a bunch of cards, get things back from the graveyard once in future. If you got something really large like a Beanstalk Giant, you can always get a Shadow Spirit to put on your Beanstalk Giant, so you get it now for trample, gain a bunch of life. If they have a very aggressive board, you can always cast it Sleep. Even if you are low on life, you can always get a Radiant Fountain, a fight spell. The sideboard here is there for you to hopefully wish for something that you need, and it's depending on the situation. I mean, even we play the Crypt and the sideboard just in case Cycling becomes a thing, which I'm not sure based on how the format is. I haven't seen too much of Cycling, but Cycling could be another deck that pops up. But not to get sidetracked, I think this deck is pretty solid. I do think if the model lane does exist for green-white or green-blue, you could definitely replace that. I mean, if you really want the scry, I actually just think, having more lands that just don't come and play tapped, I think overall makes the deck better. But I mean, the benefit of this one is that it produces green and blue, whereas the one you just choose a side, you get one or the other. But with that being said, I mean, this is definitely a deck, and going on to the next deck is actually a very similar deck, but it's the Temur version, so it's very, very similar. But let's dive into that one. They are slightly different on what they're trying to do, but they're both essentially the same deck at the end of the day. So Temur Adventures is essentially the same thing as the deck we looked at prior, but we have more red mana, allowing us to do things like Escape the Wilds, Bone Crusher Giants, We also got a new card in this deck, which unlike the other deck didn't really look like had any new cards, which is Shatterskull Smashing, which is essentially is a burn spell that allows us to tap it for X, and we can divide X, damage up amongst 2 creatures and or planeswalkers. If it's 6 or more, it deals twice X damage, divide as we choose among them instead. But essentially this is definitely a good spot removal card. It's definitely, we have the cards or the value in the deck to get to that. So essentially this could definitely become a good card if we really need it, but at the end of the day we can always play for a very aggressive land into play untapped, and we pay 3 life. This deck also takes advantage of having a wish board, allowing us to use the Lucky Clover to go wish for something. Like I said, it does play red, so we have Bonecrusher Giants for some spot removal, also Escape the Wilds essentially, which allows us to look at the top 5 cards of our library, allow us to play additional land. This deck, like I said before, is actually playing the model lands. So it's this one has the blue-red land, and also has the green-red land. Also, it does play Temple Mastery, so I guess it's trying to still combine and have enough double mana for certain things, like the Great Henge requires double mana, and also Shatterskull Smashing is double mana, but everything else is single mana cost. It takes advantage of the wish board, like I said. It does have a lot of value to get up to a very high amount of mana very quickly, because it also plays things like Ugin, has additional Great Henge in case ours in the deck gets destroyed, Primal Might for this fight, we got Kiora here depending on the deck, or Escape the Wild, Storm's Wrath if it's a lot of small drops, Naturalize, Return to Nature, destroy some spot removal, Fling to throw in a Beanstalk Giant at your opponent's face, Shadow Spear is another good card to also have your Beanstalk Giant go into your opponent's face. But overall has essentially the cards that your opponent you may need depending on what your opponent's playing. I think the sideboard is pretty solid for what Wishboard's trying to do. But yet again, this is another one of those decks like the other 3 decks. All these decks have X amount of value. If you start really going, get the Lucky Clover out, you're getting value for paying for a normal cost. You cast a Love Struck Beast, now you get 2 1/1 tokens instead of the normal 1. You get 2 Bonecrusher Giant stomps to either your opponent's creatures and or the face, double bounce spells with Brazen Borrower, and if you have more Lucky Clovers, essentially the value goes up even more. Fey Wishes to search your sideboard for multiple cards instead of just 1 card. I mean, the value here is very good, and it all essentially relies on Lucky Clover. I mean, sure, the deck is still really good without the Lucky Clover, but essentially once you get that Lucky Clover, the deck just kind of goes off, and it's very hard for your opponent to kind of catch up because your value engine is just so much greater. Also, can I just say real quick, Beanstalk Giant is with this with the Lucky Clover out, Beanstalk Giant ramp is very strong in the sense that the lands come to the battlefield untapped, so essentially you can do more stuff and get more value out of it, rather than the typical like cultivates and things like that. They come into play tapped, one goes to your hand kind of thing. So essentially this deck is just another value engine style deck. But that being said, this and the previous deck, they really didn't get touched too much with the Zendikar Rising. There are still very strong prominent decks. I think that's essentially why people are still playing them. They haven't really moved on to the new decks, because essentially you really don't need to invest too much into this deck to kind of keep it relevant, to be pretty strong in the meta as a whole. Another deck here on the list is Mono Green Stompy, or Mono Green Aggro, whatever you want to call it. It's a mid-range deck essentially, because it definitely takes advantage once we get to like turn 3, turn 4, the deck really turns on. It plays a lot of big creatures that makes it hard for your opponent to spot removal them with burn spells, and or has things that just are very large. A lot of the removal is like 3 or less, like eliminates and things like that. If they have a Heartless Act, some things have counters on them, so it makes it hard to actually spot removal the Heartless Act. We do play cards with hexproof from black, so it makes it hard for them to even target the creature with black. But overall, this is yet again is another interesting deck that hasn't really lost much. It essentially has only gained a little bit here, and this version is actually kind of cool, because I actually noticed in this version the only thing they actually added from Zendikar is actually this little kite sail, which is a 1 mana equipment that gives a creature flying, and these large creatures getting flying, I mean, just makes it harder for your opponent to block them. We have a lot of big threats in the deck. I mean, Stonecoil Serpent is a good, whenever you get it in the game, you can play it for the 1/1, you can play it for the higher thing. Definitely a good target to mutate onto with, Gem Razor to kind of spot removal your opponent's things. Quest and Beast is just overall always going to be a strong card until it leaves the format, just because it's a 4 mana 4/4. It has so much utility in the sense that it can't be blocked by things 2 or less. The Vigilance, the Death Touch, the Haste. It makes essentially just a very strong card and hard for your opponent to deal with, because essentially a lot of decks prior to turn 4 essentially are just trying to play these smaller creatures to maybe help ramp them up and or just get a wide board on the battlefield, and Quest and Beast just kind of goes right through them and doesn't even bother with them. Garruk Harbinger is a cool card. I think a lot of people overlook from M21, essentially because it's a 3 mana 4/3, but it has hexproof from black, so it's harder to spot removal, and if it deals damage to our player or planeswalker, we essentially get to scry the top of our library we have to reveal a creature card or rare planeswalker from among them, put it into our hand, put the rest on the bottom of our library in a random order. So that's pretty cool. And essentially, you know, being able to dig a little bit for more value is going to be always good. Scavenging Ooze eats our opponent's graveyard, also eats our graveyard, depending on the situation. This thing can get out of hand very quickly. Elder Gargroth has kind of seen a resurgence just because there are things that really, you know, sure, you can bounce it back to your hand, but there's not many things that can really stand in its way, and essentially no one really wants to put something in its way because it has Vigilance, it has Reach, it has Trample, and whenever it attacks and or blocks, we get one of these 3 effects. So he's a very strong card, also has a Great Henge because Great Henge is just that good. 23 lands is pretty solid just because, you know, it has a lot of value to it. It's maybe on the little bit more expensive side, but once we kind of get to this turn, you know, turn 3, turn 4, we can essentially play like one of these 4-drops here, or even the Elder Gargroth, get this to be really cheap, essentially just being 2 cost in or 3 cost in. And then we essentially just kind of go off in that sense. This is actually another cool eventual impulse. Allows us to look at top 3 cards of our library, reveal land or creature among them, put it into our hand, put the rest in the bottom of our library in order. Essentially allowing us to kind of dig for what we need, essentially in the late game and in the early game. But overall, just so much value in this deck. Things are just very hard to remove, and when our opponent maybe has the upper, it's really hard for our opponent to get an upper hand. But I mean, maybe against a teamer matchup, it may struggle a little bit with all the bounce effects. But if you can kind of get the edge on your opponent and play these big things before they can really do anything on the board, they're just gonna have a hard time to kind of regain control of the board and really win against you. But overall, this is a deck that I think didn't lose anything. It only gained a little bit. I'm sure there's other green cards in Zendikar Horizon that I'm sure people have put builds in to put in here. There's a few cards that I may tweak and put in a version of my own if I decide to run this, just because there's a few cards I kind of like that are uncommons and things like that I think just overall make things just a little bit better, just because I like to give things trample and make spam through just that much better. But overall, a pretty decent deck and pretty fun to play from what I remembered in the standard 2021 playlist. So the next deck up on the list is the second most played deck, and that is mono red. I mean, it wouldn't be a meta, I mean, essentially even without mono red. But overall, the deck it really hasn't lost much. If anything, it's kind of, you know, it's kind of lost a little bit. You know, we don't have things like the lizard. We don't have things to go dig our library for 3 cards, but we kind of replace some things with other value things to kind of overall round out the deck. You know, it's still got the Fervent Champions, it's got some Fireblade Chargers, which is a new card from Zendikar Horizon. If it equipped, it's haste, but it's one of those things that if it dies, it deals that damage, equal damage to its power to any target. So essentially you can throw it and, you know, hit something for 1 damage after it's blocked into this, or if it, let's just say it has the Embercleave or it has a Rimrock Knight pump on it, essentially it's going to hit whatever for that much damage that it has. You know, this deck plays Red Cat melee, so it's one of those things, I guess, to get X amount of damage in on your opponent. You don't have to play this main board. You can always play more spot removal. You could add another shock. Maybe if you are seeing that you're having issues running into things, you always play the Red Cat melee instead. But I think essentially the shock is something I would remove. It's got spot removal to get rid of Lucky Clover, because, you know, Lucky Clover, it makes kind of those decks go off. So being able to play something to remove it is always good. Rimrock Knight, like I said, because the pump, and also it's a 3/1 robber. Shadow Skull Smashing's in here too for some spot removal, but essentially it's playing all the same guys. This one's interesting too in the sense that this is a haster 3 mana 2/2er, but whenever it deals damage to a player, that player creates a 0/1 Goblin construct with artifact that this creature can't block, and at the beginning of their upkeep, this deals 1 damage to you. So essentially you get to create these tokens that make your opponent take damage. Slaying Fire is a card that's pretty solid. It deals 4 damage instead if it casts 3 red mana. Annex is strong, also has Torbrand, also has Embercleave, and the deck doesn't need that many lands. There's 21 lands in the deck, but overall mono red really hasn't lost a step. I'm sure there's various iterations out there. There's some cards in here that I haven't seen. There's, I think, other spot removal cards that do X amount of damage that you could possibly play in here, but overall a pretty strong deck. And like I said, I'll leave all the links for these decks in the description below, but let's move on to the top deck that a lot of people are playing. I feel like from the way I seeing how you guys responded to the deck when I did a deck video on it, and also the questions you asked me in my budget video, I feel like you guys may have an idea of what the top meta deck currently is, and I think it's just because it's new and it is essentially a fun deck, but it is definitely annoying to play against. And the number 1 deck that is currently being played in the meta is Dimir Rogues. Essentially this deck is fairly strong. It just disrupts what your opponent's trying to do, in the fact that a lot of the things mill your opponent. It's not really trying to mill your opponent out, but it does disrupt what they're trying to do, just because You know, you can be milling away the land they're looking for. It can be milling away an answer they're looking for. It hurts them whenever they try to set up the top of their library because, you know, it mills away whatever they scry into to kind of set up possibly a draw. It takes advantage of, you know, it has a lot of things with flash, so it kind of catches, it's more reactive in the sense. In the early game, you know, we play things like Thieves Guild Enforcer, so you play it at the end of your opponent's turn instead of on your turn. The Wind Robber is, you know, one of those things that you play on your turn, but it's a 1/1 that starts milling your opponent, and in the later game, if they have a lot of things in the graveyard, you can sacrifice to draw a card. Sorin Thought Thief makes whenever we attack with a rogue, the opponent mills a card. Drown in the Lock is a solid card because once their library starts filling up, it counts as a kill spell and or a counter spell. Lofty Denial kind of, you know, it's pretty good because a lot of our rogues have fly-in, so it's definitely a strong counter for 2 mana. This is a Disruption. It's definitely a good early game kind of counter spell just for 2 mana. We can always play it for the tap lane in the later game. Confounded Conundrum is what shuts down like the Lotus decks or the Ramp decks, because whenever a land enters the battlefield under an opponent's control, if that player had another land enter the battlefield under the control this turn, they return a land they control to its owner's hand. So essentially it just slows them down. Essentially, I mean, sure, it bounces the land back to their hand, but it overall will prevent them from really just getting a large mana base to take an overall advantage. And I'm actually kind of curious on how that's playing out. I haven't really played in like the top meta recently. I think I'm gonna wait until October to really jump back into the meta, just because I haven't really played you know, current standard or even like ranked standard in September. So I think I'm gonna wait till October just to kind of get a fresh start and go from there. But you know, we'll see how the meta kind of shifts as we get more and more to October. We got Glasspool Mimic, which is cool because it comes a copy of a creature, so essentially it can become a copy of whatever we really need, whether it's, you know, a Sorin Thought Thief or even a Nighthawk Scavenger. This is also a solid card too because it gets 1 power for equal to the number of card types in our opponent's graveyard. Brazen Borrower, of course, because it's a rogue and essentially has a bounce spell. So the Royal Switch is an interesting card here. I don't know if this is something I would play. I would maybe try to get some other value from other rogues in the set. But I think, you know, it's an interesting thing just because a lot of the rogues that we are playing are flashers. So being able to make our opponent lose a life and we get to draw a card is a cool thing. But I'll be quite honest, it's not my favorite when it comes to flash cards. It was kind of a cool idea back when this first came out, but I honestly don't think it ever lived up to the hype it really was trying to do. You got Agdeem's Awakening, which is an interesting card. You know, it's a very interesting late game card. Essentially, if our board's been wiped, we turn this on like turn 7. We tap it for 7 mana. We get to return things that cost less than 4. So it has to be 4, 3, 2, 1. Essentially, getting back X amount of rogues. Or in the early game, we can always play it into the battlefield as a land, and we pay 3 life, and we kind of get into play untapped. Actually, Essence is kind of a cool thing. You know, counter target spell. Your opponents can't cast spells with the same name as the exile card. When it leaves the battlefield, return the exile card to the owner's hand. So an interesting card there, but you know, it's kind of interesting whether or not if this is something I would play. But this is just the deck that I clicked on for the meta deck for Dimir Rogues. Rankle's yet again another solid thing. It puts our opponent in a weird spot just on the basis of it makes them either sacrifice a creature, lose a life and draw a card, or discard a card. So essentially in the late game, depending on what we need, we can kind of do one of those things. I'm sure we can kind of get rid of some rogues if we really need to kind of get rid of make our opponent sacrifice a creature. And then we got Zareth, which is the Trickster, which essentially is a pretty cool card in the sense that if we attack him with our rogues and, you know, they don't block one and maybe they're tapped out or something, we can always tap 4 mana. We can switch them out with the rogue that's attacking that's unblocked. And then we get to deal damage to our opponent, which is a 4/4. So essentially we can swap out a smaller rogue. And then we get to take a permanent card from their graveyard and put it on the battlefield under our control. So essentially it's like a weird like mind control kind of card, but we kind of take their card. But you know, it has to do damage in order to do that. So it's a little tough. Like once we do it once, maybe our opponent then plays something to kind of block it. It doesn't have flying, so it kind of slows it down there. But at least you can kind of steal something at least once. Maybe just kind of, I don't know, take maybe a key card that they want to try to return. But overall, fun card to kind of mess around with. I think 2 is actually the proper number, just because I don't think playing more than it is something you don't want to draw too many of. But when you do draw it, it's very, very potent. And the mana base is pretty straightforward. What it's trying to do, you know, you got to the Clear Water Pathway, the Murk Water Pathway, Swamps, Castle Lockbane, Castle Venturous, Islands, and Fabled Passages, and some Temple Deceits just in case to set things up. But overall, I mean, you know, this is a very strong deck. It's very potent. I mean, even playing like the budget version of the deck, which I did make, it's still very good, especially when it gets the right cards on the battlefield. But with that being said, guys, if you did enjoy this video, let me know in the comments below maybe a deck that you're interested in playing out of all these. I know these aren't budget versions. These are more the meta, like top tier, higher end versions. So they do require a lot of rares, a lot of mythics. I do have a budget video of some of these decks that I did make. There'll be a link up top or in the description. I have all the decks I did go over in today's video in the description down below. As I'm doing this a little bit of an outro, I'm sure YouTube's popping up, like, check out these videos that are up on the channel. Here, you can click one of those to kind of continue your watching of the channel. But until next time, guys, if you like the video, hit that like button. And if you want to know when I post more videos, hit that subscribe button. I'll see you later.